Good day. It is, what is it again? It's February 22nd, 2023, where all the years go. Welcome to the Cory Morgan Show. As per the name of the show, I am Cory Morgan. This is the Western Standards Live weekly thing where I speak to guests, I rant, I rave, I cover news items, and we interact. I just want to remind everybody, use that comment scroll, maybe not necessarily to plug other links to watch, but to, chat with each other, send questions my way, send questions at each other. Just keep it civil, of course, all the time. I mean, it can be a little bit tasteless. Lord knows I am quite often, but we don't have to be at each other's throats. We can have a good, productive time here for this show. I got a good guest coming up in a while here. It's Professor Tom Flanagan. Some people are probably familiar with him in conservative circles. He was a strong advisor for Prime Minister Stephen Harper. He'd written a number of books, one of which was called First Nations Second Thoughts. He's very much studied on First Nation issues and things like that. And we've had it before. And of course, it just seems now it's almost weekly. I mean, when we booked Professor Flanagan to talk about this, there had been a recent discovery, I guess you could say, of GPR anomalies on a residential school site. And even since then, yet another one has popped up. So, we want to discuss that a little. I mean, where's this going to go? When are we ever going to see an end to this? Is there going to be resolution? Is there going to be investigation? So I'm looking forward to that conversation. And of course, lots of other rants and news items. So good to see you all checking in there. David, Lisa, all the way out from Nova Scotia, Patricia up there in Chauvin, Shelley in Edmonton, and Lorna and Tracy, all you guys checking in. I like seeing that. I like knowing there's actually people on the other end watching. It's not just me talking to myself as I do when I drive and such. So if you're from out of the province, you might not know, but it is cold as balls in Alberta right now. That was terrible. And I'm cheap. I walk a long ways in here to avoid paying too much for parking, but man, it's chilly. Times like this, I do feel, we talk about that a lot. Arthur Green, our reporter up in Edmonton, and Jonathan Bradley here in Calgary, I mean, they've been covering a lot with how things have been getting bad and out of control for our homeless population, our addicts, because they're overwhelming and getting onto our transit systems, and it's causing a lot of problems and things. And times like now, we're going to see it. We're going to see it because a lot of the addicts end up retreating onto the trains and into the stations to get warm. And we're going to see security somewhere kicking them out, and everybody's going to scream and howl and go bananas about it. Happens every cold snap. And it'll happen again this time. What has to be kept in mind, and I don't know, I can't speak for Edmonton, but I'm sure it's similar. In Calgary, we have shuttles. We actually have shuttles that will pick them up and take them to a heated center. There's not a matter of people say, they have no choice. They got to stay warm. Well, they do have to stay warm. And I do feel for them. I can't imagine how horrible it is for those addicts out there right now in this weather. But they don't belong in the damn train. They don't. It's not where they are. People trying to ride to work, people trying to commute and having to deal with that. And they aren't just being thrown out into the cold. So if you see those videos, they don't do that. I mean, they throw them off the train. Yes, well, remove them. They aren't throwing them. And there are centers. Part of the problem with homeless centers, the reason they don't want to go is they can't shoot up in them. They can't smoke their meth in them. They can't be wasted in them. That's the problem. That's the issue they have. And that's where a lot of the misplaced sympathy starts coming around too. We keep talking about the unhoused and the vulnerable, and they certainly are. But let's call it what it is. The vast majority of them with the problem are addicts. They're not somebody who fell through the cracks. They're not there because I love seeing constant articles, rising rents or what are causing homelessness. Well, they contribute. But come on, are you really telling me that that person walking up and down on the curb holding the sign covered with, pockmarks from the meth he's been smoking, how low would rent have to get before that gentleman is ready to move into a house? Come on. The problem is the addiction, and that's what we got to focus on. Good news on that front too, I guess. It's campaign style, but it's continuing the theme. In Alberta, Premier Smith and the health minister have been announcing massive increases in the funding for more treatment, more mental health supports, things like that. They're addressing the problem. Rent is a problem, but it's not the problem making these folks homeless. Okay, I digressed from my other rant. Unfortunately, our news editor, Dave Naylor, won't be making it in for his check-in today. He's loafing around his house, sipping on some sort of licensed product, I'm sure, or another. So he's gotten out of it today. So it's just all me, and later on a little bit of Professor Flanagan. So I'm going to talk about, though, what's got me ranting today. And that's about tipping. And tipping's been a part of North American culture for generations. And now and then we hear of some movement or another calling for an end to the practice. but it's never really would go anywhere. Something's changed in the last few years, though. I mean, tipping has expanded into non-traditional industries, and the amounts being asked are growing. And consumers, they're starting to feel picked clean, and they're right. I mean, prices for everything are rising, and we can't afford to top up every purchase price for a product with a 15 to 25% tip. It's one thing to leave a tip for a server after spending an hour or two at a restaurant, quite another to expect a tip for a retail purchase. Now, I'm going to offer a recent and somewhat embarrassing personal example. This last week, I went to a specialty bakery in Calgary to buy some keto diet items. I won't bother saying which bakery. There's a few of them around there. This bakery, though, had signs plastered on their outside door and all over their walls, bragging of how they're a living wage employer. Again, whatever, I shrugged and entered. I mean, it's their business. What they want to pay their employees is up to them. I quickly, of course, got to see what comes with a living wage when I picked up a loaf of bread and took it to the counter and was charged an eye-popping $16. Now, I knew keto was going to be expensive, but holy crap. I guess it's because they're paying every retail clerk $20 an hour or $22 or whatever they're determining a living wage is these days. Either way, I gulped, but decided to purchase the bread and get the hell out of there anyways. That's the first embarrassment. I should have just stopped my purchase when I saw the price. When I was handed the payment pad, though, then the all too common prompts for tips were on the screen, with the lowest of them being 15%. I mean, what the hell did the bored kid sitting behind the counter do to earn a tip? Thought, I'll show him. I chose the manual option and only left a $1 tip. Yeah, that's the second embarrassment. If it bothered me, why did I tip at all? We are so conditioned to tip. I felt almost shamed into leaving at least a little something. And it's a ridiculous notion, and I should know better. I hope I learned something there. Now, businesses that didn't traditionally command tips in the past have been using the option of those payment pads to try and supplement their staff wages with it. It helps them reduce a little of the sticker shock, I guess, with customers as the inflation forces them to raise prices too, but it's a disingenuous way to go about it. And those payment machines make it easy to slip the tips in as an option without actually asking for them. I even heard of somebody being prompted for a tip for an item they ordered online. I mean, you're just talking to a computer service at that point. It's getting ridiculous. Tipping needs to be reined in, but I don't want to see it eliminated, as some people have called for. It's just crept into the wrong businesses, and consumers need to stop indulging them. And yes, I'm guilty of that. I did it. In some service-based industries, though, tipping should remain. I mean, I look at tipping as something that should be considered if the person has had extended direct experience with the service provider. And in that, I mean with a few examples, like in a restaurant with a bar server or a bartender who communicates, converses, and serves a table for periods that could last hours. Or a bartender who listens to a person laying out the challenges of their lives and lends a sympathetic ear. I did that. I was a bartender. Let you know an industry secret. The bartender usually doesn't really care, and the stripper doesn't really have a crush on you. But all the same, throw your tips out there, guys. They're doing something above and beyond just serving you a drink or offering a lap dance or whatever else. A tour guide, spends an afternoon showing sights and narrating behind him. A cab driver, conversation online, on a ride, lends tips for local attractions. You see the theme, though, right? A tip is for interaction, and only when the interaction goes above and beyond the basic service. Now, tipping is the ultimate form of merit pay. I mean, the consumer's in full control. You can directly influence the compensation of the person who is offering the service and incentivizes the worker to do as good a job as possible. When I owned a pub, it was easy to see which servers and bartenders gave the best services. I mean, some consistently brought in as much as 20 to 30% more in tips than other workers. And the formula is pretty simple. Just be friendly, attentive, and polite. Harder than one would think with some servers, though, especially as an owner, you find out. But it gave me, as an owner, a visible measure of who gave the customers the best service. And it ensured, I, of course, worked harder to make sure those servers got as many prime shifts as possible. The customers won, the ambitious servers won, and I, as an owner, won. Well, many restaurants, they've tried to go with tip-free models, and it always fails. Earl's in Calgary tried it a few years ago, and it only lasted a few months. I mean, while they paid a much bigger hourly rate to the servers to compensate for the lack of tips, the ambitious servers said to hell with this, and they quit and went to restaurants where they could earn tips. They wanted to get the better, work harder, and make the money. The servers who remained, of course, were those who preferred to just sit about and take an hourly wage. So service levels went down while the prices shot up. The restaurant had to return to the old way and fast because the consumers, of course, fled. People like to point out tipping isn't the standard in some other countries, and that's true. But in my travel experience, I found that the service drops as well. And I was in Australia a while back, for example, and unless you're in a formal and expensive restaurant, well, you have to go to a window, order, and pay, and then get a little number, and then you sit at their table, then they call your number, and you go and get your food. Meanwhile, you go to another lineup, and you go and you pay, and you get your drink, and if you drink multiple drinks, you got to go multiple times. And the prices are high. You know what? I'd rather tip and have table service. That's why I went out. I really missed that while I was down there. If I'm going to do nothing but self-service, I might as well just get takeout and go home. The only way to change the trend in tipping for consumers, though, is you've got to put your feet and your wallets down on the issue. Refuse to tip for retail services and only tip in the traditional industries. We can't get the government in on banning tipping, and it's well out of their role anyway. Who are they to tell me who I can give my own money to? We have let the practice of tipping spread too far, but it's up to us to bring it back where it belongs. And I'm going to check myself before habitually tipping from here on in. And yes, I sure as hell won't be spending $16 on a loaf of sourdough bread as well. So last week was a good learning week for me, guys. And those are my thoughts on the tipping. We're seeing more of it. And yeah, we can correct it. It is up to us. This is the difference between us as conservatives and others as liberals. Okay, the tipping's got out of control. The asks, they're annoying. But I don't want the government to step in and fix it for me. We have to do it ourselves. And we can. We just got to say, what? Dude, I'm just paying for a loaf of bread. I'm not giving you a tip. Likewise, for whatever else you're doing. So, yeah, I'm just going to see through the comments here. Darren saying pay cash and cash only. That was one more thing at that place. They wouldn't take cash. There was a big sign up saying, for the health of our workers. It was a really weird, woke little spot, this bakery I went into, and I won't again. Hey, power to them if they get their little market. They can do what they want. But Darren saying, why are you tipping for self-serve? Yeah, I know. That's what I said. I'm admitting error here, okay? It was embarrassing. I shouldn't have. Saxon Riverstone saying some restaurants want 18%. Yeah, that's part of it too. The prompts, they start at 15. Like I remember way back when I started going to restaurants when I was young, and GST back then was 7%. The easy formula a lot of people said for tipping typically was double the GST, gave 14 to 15% a tip on something. So if you mentally do the math that hard, you see the GST on the bill. Now, 15 is the minimum. Tracy Totten saying service has gone downhill as tipping keeps going up. Well, I don't know. That depends. That's place by place, I think, but in some areas, yeah, it still goes downhill even as it goes up. Lorianne saying Milton Truck Stop has them. Yeah, seriously, unless there's an interaction. And like I said, that's a little different. If somebody's giving you a pedicure for half an hour, or I've never had one, but I imagine it's an involved thing and some social interaction. That's where it comes in, or even, bellhops. There's a little bit of a different thing in the old fancy hotels. If you went in, you better make sure that bellhop gets a good tip, but then you'll also ensure you're going to get fast service for things from there on in too. Just as another thing to point out as somebody who was in the industry for quite a while as a restaurant owner. Well, it was only 5 years, but it felt a lot longer. We do remember the good and bad tippers. And it's not like we'll go out of our way not to serve the ones who are bad tippers, but you're going to be more attentive with the ones are good ones. It does happen. Especially on a busy night when you're really scrambling, you're walking, and that person snapping their fingers over there who never tips you wants their fifth supplemental order of ranch, whilst the person over there needs another beer. I'm going to not see the one who needed the ranch, and I will hustle to the one who tips and wants the beer. Just makes your experience a little better. And tipping based on the cost of food doesn't seem like a level playing field for servers working at lower moderately priced restaurants. Well, again, it's up to you. It's up to you. You can go lower. The difference on the high-end restaurants, for example, if we want to talk about, is typically, and no, not every restaurant's going to do it wisely that way, but you're going to have a lot fewer tables per server because you want to give better service. You're not going to give a server 10 tables in a high-end restaurant because people are going to get pretty upset when you're going to end up with a 4-person table and their bill is going to be into the hundreds of dollars. They don't want to be looking at empty drink glasses and plates finished and sitting in front of them for too long. And that restaurant is going to go down fast because when you pay for the extra and the better place, you typically, again, if they that's the business model, are going to get a better service. Plus the larger, so that server is counting on a larger tip because they aren't getting as many tables to turn over. Also, most restaurants, not all, will have a tip out system. So part of that does go to the back. We did that at our place. Every server, when they finished their night, had to give a portion of their tips, and it would go towards everybody from the dishwasher to the cook and so on. Sometimes it goes to management. It didn't in our place. Either way, I'm just saying, we can knee jerk, and some people saying, we got to end tipping altogether. And no, I don't think so. We just got to get it kind of back to where it belonged. And yeah, they're asking too much in a lot of cases. 30%, come on. I need a neck massage with my meal for that. And it's just not going to happen. All right, let's get off that and get on to a little bit of other stuff. I see we got a cancel crowd planning to protest Jordan Peterson. He's been on tour. We'll see if they actually come out. They like to top big and deliver low. We saw that in Ottawa when all of these groups were saying, oh, we're going to come out and protest Peterson. And guess what? Not a single one of them did. But this Sunday, it's going to be in Calgary at the Jubilee Auditorium. So, hey, buy tickets, get out there, because that's what I like to push back on it too. They have the right to protest and whine and complain because Peterson's going to speak to people. But I have the right to promote and say, hey, guys, get out there, buy a ticket and take it in. You know, let's use the Streisand effect. If people aren't familiar with it, it's usually just when something happens and protesters or opposition actually bring more attention to whatever it was in the first place. Well, let's make more attention. Let's make sure that thing sells out. And because Peterson, he has some great stuff to say. All right. Little side notes. I saw this story pop up from Arthur. We've been hearing all that stuff every year. The thing comes out about baby names, whose babies were named this and that every year, whatever. I mean, at my age and due to a number of physiological things, I don't have to worry about naming babies again ever. But it is kind of interesting in a trivial way to see what names are topping the list. I guess Noah has been for a long time, and Olivia. But something else that's, just a side note, Linda Gibson says that Peterson's thing is sold out. Okay, well, that's good to hear. And he's coming back in May, by the way. So, even if you can't get tickets for that, you can always go there just to thumb your nose at the counter protesters if you got nothing better to do on a Sunday. But good to get the update. All right, either way, another side note that apparently not a single child, though in Alberta, thousands and thousands born, not a single one was named Karen. Now, that's a shame. It really is. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that name. In fact, the mother of my first son was named Karen. It's a fine name. And unfortunately, internet memes and new ways of speaking about things have actually managed to completely ruin a name. It's taken it out of use. I think it's going to take a generation before we start seeing people named Karen again. What can you do about it? I don't know. There's probably nothing you can do about it. I mean, it all started with those little memes. It was usually a pet and a person, and the pet saying, hey, okay, Karen, do this and stuff like that. It was funny stuff. But either way, the backlash has actually gotten to the point where nobody is naming their children Karen any longer. The name Karen has been killed by the internet, and it's going to be very rare to see anybody 20 years from now, who's young, named Karen. I wonder what names are going to be ruined next, Just like you don't see anybody named Adolf anymore, but I mean, Karen's didn't do anything nearly as terribly bad as a historical Adolf did. But, with the internet can take things and change them and our perceptions of them. I just find it as a pop trivia sort of noteworthy thing with that odd, side effect of the Karen thing. Let's see, I'm going to just nag folks too. We should be getting to guest time fairly soon, but he's not there quite yet. And to remind folks too to subscribe. Usually it's after the news update when I do that. This is how we stay independent. The CBC, that horrific state broadcaster, charging $1.5 billion a year, stealing advertising dollars from the market, and of course, carrying the water for the Liberal Party of Canada. It's awful. The best way to push back on that, the best way would be to defund and get rid of it altogether. But in the meantime, independent media, you got to support us, guys. We don't take tax dollars. We won't. Big point of pride with us. We totally rely on you guys for subscriptions. And I know most of you guys watching have already subscribed. It's only $10 a month. It's less than an old newspaper subscription used to be. But $99 per year. That's how we can keep rolling. That's how we keep all that good reporting. Nigel Hannaford there in opinion. I saw the staff meeting today. Nigel and Dave put, I think, over 30 stories came out over the long weekend. I mean, we are really putting out the content more than the legacy media guys. And that's because of you guys who have subscribed. And if you haven't already, come on, get on there. As you can see that link, westernstandard.news/membership. Take out that subscription and help support independent, free-speaking media. All right, let's see into another news story. We're going to talk a little bit about this in the pipeline, which is another one of our shows we're going to do a little later. But this was an incident. We'll see what happens as details emerge with it and things. Halton Region Police charged Milton, Ontario resident Ali Meehan with second-degree murder after he allegedly killed a robber who broke into his home. Now, this is getting... you're automatically charged with murder if you defend your home with a firearm. That's the way it goes. It doesn't matter what the circumstances. We don't know the circumstances with this one. There could be some more to it and things like that. But you are guilty until proven innocent when it comes to defending your home with a firearm, and that's a real problem. I mean, we saw that with Eddie Maurice. We saw it with Roland Stanley. There was another Ontario case a while back, and all three of those guys eventually had charges dropped or were acquitted by juries. Because when it's put to people with common sense, they say, no, you had the right to do that. But in the meantime, you were charged and you have to run the gauntlet. And deal with that and defend yourself, sometimes at great expense and under a great deal of stress. And well, here's yet another case. So it's going to be interesting to see where it goes as the evidence comes out. But I mean, how many times have we got to put it to juries? Because you don't want to put it to a judge because they're often liberal appointed and they'll just convict you. But juries, when it's your peers, and that's the point of it, can look at those and say, you know what, I would have done the same thing. That's why it's your peers. And it's that's why they say, well, no, I would have done the same thing. You can go free. As Darren Bailey says, if you defend yourself in Canada, you're the criminal. You're supposed to simply die. Almost, I mean, I remember the term I was using over the whole Eddie Maurice thing when that was going on. He was a young man who defended his family. He just wounded the fella and went through months and months of court, and he was arrested and a bunch of things. And the way the police were telling you is you're supposed to dial, cower, and pray. If somebody's coming into your rural property, even though the police acknowledge in my area, that's right, Eddie Maurice, we're in the same county down there, 40-minute response times for police on average. So if you've got a violent criminal coming up to your doorstep, call 911, lock the door, hope they don't break in, and then curl up in a ball and pray that the police will get there in time. Or you can defend yourself and deal with the courts later. Like the old saying, I'd rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6. Now, the other part I don't agree with Darren on, though. He says restaurants that required proof of vaccination, you have to boycott them. Well, you know what? That was almost all of them. They had no choice. Take it out on the government. Take it out on the legislation. Absolutely. I'm just seeing, I've just got to send a link to Professor Flanagan here. So bear with me as I move this around. He says he didn't get it, so I must have miss-sent it. So pardon me, guys, I'm just babbling here, but we don't want to miss out our guest. At least I know why he's not here, and hopefully he'll be here really soon. I'll get it again. Come on, paste. Nothing goes slower than when you got something like this going on, right? No, that didn't work. Oh, there we go. No, now it pasted twice.
Canadian Shooting Sports Association. Without the CSSA, our gun rights would have been taken long ago. These guys are on the front lines helping to draft smart and intelligent firearms regulations and legislation in Canada, and more importantly, educating the public about how we keep guns out of the hands of the wrong people. To become a member, it's absolutely worth every penny.
Okay, one of those emergency commercial breaks. And hey, the CSSA, it was a good segue anyways. We were talking about self-defense and rights like that. And that is a group that stands up for your rights to own a firearm, whether, not so much for self-defense, but for sporting use, whether it's target shooting, duck hunting, whatever you might want it to be. Getting back to the restaurants, like I was talking about, yes, Jane, it wasn't me who thought of that. Actually, it was Nico who was quicker on the ball going to commercial. But restaurants, okay, on average, your restaurant's running on a 5% margin. If you lose your liquor license, you're out of business. If the health inspector pulls your license, you're out of business. Most restaurant owners don't have a big amount of money to be able to keep getting by. And a lot of them, like I look at Benny's in Calgary. I went there, by the way, and I'll give them nothing but plugs. They stood up, they tried, they pushed back against the vaccine passports. In the end, though, they had to relent. He had to pay his bills. He had to open. But at least he spoke up. He did more than a lot of others. And so would you boycott him? Because that's what you're saying, because he did end up putting the vax passport thing in, because his only other choice was to go bankrupt. Get angry at the state and the government who put the gun to the head of these restaurants. Or likewise, as Darren's upset with his church because of doing that. Okay, fine. But you're punishing the victim, in my view, in that case. But I mean, you're voting with your feet. And by all means, that's what I always recommend for people on items and issues. But I just, don't agree with you on that one. But we don't always have to agree. Okay, we've got Professor Flanagan there on deck. We'll bring him in. We've got that link out there properly because I've been looking forward to this discussion. So let's get him on in here and we will discuss, well, a nice simple issue of residential school sites and possible burials on them. So yes, there we go. We'll just kind of center the cameras there. Hello, sorry about the link confusion there, Mr. Flanagan.
Hi, Cory.
It's good to have you on. So something I said very earlier in the show, I kind of framed it before we brought you in, was that when we first booked you, which was a while back, it was based on which reserve that was, one of the ones, Star Blanket, announcing that they'd found a bunch of anomalies with their GPR. And even since then, yet another one up in Port Alberni, BC area now is reporting the same thing. Like, this is this issue is just going on and on and on, but there doesn't seem to be any resolution going on.
Excuse me a second. I think my camera is tilted.
That's all right.
It looked like I was having a liquid lunch or something, but I'm not. It just let's try it again with I moved my camera on my set.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh, you're well centered now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this has happened now in 7 or 8 different First Nations around the country, and will happen at more, because the federal government has appropriated a large amount of money for this kind of searching, and so bands are taking advantage of it to hire somebody to push ground penetrating radar around. It's more than that. They also will hire some of their own people to go do sort of oral history projects, talking to members about their memories or perhaps what they have heard about residential schools. So it becomes a fairly major effort engaging a lot of people. So anyway, you're going to hear more stories like that for sure.
Yeah, well, and oral history, I mean, that's kind of a whole loaded realm on its own. I mean, I understand wanting to give some weight to oral history. You have a culture that's been around that didn't have a written language, so you had to rely on things being passed down. But all the same, we have to recognize and understand that oral history is also notoriously inaccurate at times, and to base something as serious as this on just the oral history, I mean, we need much deeper investigation into some of the things that have been alleged.
Yeah, I think we can use our court system as an example. Oral testimony is admitted all the time in the form of eyewitness testimony, and even some forms of hearsay evidence are admitted if it's expert testimony, for example, scientist or whatever. But oral history in a court proceeding is always subject to testing. First of all, there's a possibility of cross-examination by counsel for the other side. And then there is introduction of other kinds of evidence to compare against oral evidence. Other kinds of evidence would be, for example, written documents. In the case of ancient events, you might have archaeological evidence. Even linguistic evidence about language change can give you ideas about movement of people. So there are many kinds of evidence, and what our courts do is admit oral evidence, but triangulate it against others. And I think that's what we should be doing here. There may be something to these oral accounts that are being gathered, but until they're subject to corroboration, and maybe even against other oral accounts. This is another part of it. You have in a court proceeding, you have a witness for one side, you have a witness for another side. Maybe they saw different things, or don't remember it differently. So you've got to do all this triangulation. And that's what's not being done at the present time.
No, and as you'd said, I mean, that explains a lot of it. I mean, when people have a means to make money, they've kind of created a cottage industry. It was a large amount put out just for GPR surveys and things such as that. And I guess people can't necessarily even be faulted for taking advantage of the program. But, getting to the truth of things, I kind of want to come around back and a bit with the oral history and the Kamloops residential school, which set the whole thing off sort of to begin with. Because a lot of that was based on stories of... it was terrible stories of children basically being murdered, snuck out in the night, buried in an apple orchard. But aside from the oral history of that, there's no other record or anything could be found to corroborate that. Now, the GPR has been done, and they found a bunch of anomalies, but nothing else has been done since. Is there going to be further investigation? And if not, how can we prompt it?
Well, I doubt there will be. Some of the leaders at Kamloops promised that there would be, but it hasn't happened, and more than a year has gone by, and no soil was turned. I think there's a recognition at some level that digging is risky because it might upset the whole apple cart. What they're going to find at Kamloops, I'm pretty sure, is that these soil anomalies in that particular place are due to the installation of a septic field in the 1920s. A new sanitation system was put in the school. There was a big septic tank, and then there was a field of weeping tile to disperse the liquids. About something like 2,000 feet of weeping tile were planted in the same area where the apple orchard now is, and in the same area where they did the testing with the GPR. So that's probably what they're going to find if they ever do actually dig. So I think a lot of people perhaps realize that digging is too risky for the for the cause that they're engaged in. They're much better off by issuing press releases about soil anomalies, hoping that gullible figures in the press, as they often do, will turn those into reports of actual burials. I mean, it was in the headline today on the one from Port Alberni about, more unmarked graves found. Well, no unmarked grave has been found anywhere yet in Canada before or after the reports from Kamloops. There have been now thousands of soil anomalies have been reported, but, well, maybe thousands are too strong, but certainly over 1,000. No, actually, thousands is not too strong, because from Lebret in the Qu'Appelle Valley, they claim to have 2,000 soil anomalies. So we're up into the thousands, but there is not a single credible report, or any kind of report, really, not even a dubious report, of exhuming a human skeleton, child or otherwise. I mean, there's nothing. I've never seen a story go so far with so little evidence. It's really quite remarkable.
Well, yeah, and in oral history, was it? Oh, I can forget the name of it. There was a hospital in Edmonton. It was a tuberculosis hospital way back in its time, and there were some First Nations people claimed that First Nations kids had been buried on the grounds of that, and they did a GPR survey, and they found 33 anomalies, and in 2 different digs, didn't find a single bit of human remains. We didn't hear a heck of a lot about that, though.
No, you don't hear
about.
You don't hear about the negative evidence. But so anyway, I'm not holding my breath for any digs to take place. Now, the most recent report is that the federal government has engaged a company from the Netherlands that specializes in looking for remains of missing children, and apparently a serious company with scientific credibility, to come over and consult about the right way to approach this. But we're already getting protests from this side of the water from Native leaders about, well, there wasn't enough consultation. These people are going to be insensitive to our culture. What are their protocols? All on and on. Oh, sorry, Cory, I bumped my rig here. All we're hearing is reasons not to fully cooperate with this investigation from outside. So my guess is that at the end of the day, we will continue to get the reports without any real verification, or in some cases, highly dubious verification, like the bone that was found in part of a skull, I think it was found at Lebret. But that wasn't handled properly. Didn't really tell us very much, and we have no idea that it for sure whether it came from an Indian child who might have been at the school, or some other child. I mean, there's all kinds of people who have lived in this Qu'Appelle Valley for a long time. So that's where we are. Frankly, no serious evidence. No evidence that a competent court would grant any credence to.
Oh, and then there's other showings, and it frustrates me to watch the press and the way they cover that, at least a lot of the legacy media. I had the opportunity last summer. I went up to Grouard in northern Alberta. I had to do some stuff in High Prairie, and I went and checked out the Grouard site, and that was a large residential school in an isolated area. It has actually kind of a nice big cathedral there. They use it as a college for First Nations people. Still a bit of a rough town, as many reserves are. But the area, because that was another one where, they found a whole bunch of anomalies, and I went physically to where it was. And yes, it's a Catholic cemetery on a hill. It's fenced in even. So yes, they did their survey inside the cemetery, and you could see, even just looking at the grass, the disturbances. Yes, there certainly was somebody buried there at some time. Chances are, and you see on most reserves, there usually a wooden cross gets put in, and after time it disintegrates and goes away. But this isn't a discovery. This is just establishing a known burial site. But it doesn't get represented that way when it hits the news.
Yeah, this is another angle on it. Some of the reports concern areas that you might say are greenfield. They're just seeing what they might find. In other cases, they are running their machines in areas that are known to have been cemeteries. Usually they're parish cemeteries. I mean, most residential schools were located near towns or villages, and there was a Catholic or Anglican parish there and would have its cemetery. And sometimes children who died at the school were buried there. Not great numbers, but occasionally. But other people were buried there. So you start using ground penetrating radar on an old cemetery. Sure, you're going to find soil anomalies. And if you dug, you might well find skeletons or remains. But would they be the remains of children who somehow disappeared from the school? Well, you'd have to have other evidence. And again, we haven't seen any evidence of that.
Well, and again, like let's just say, for example, they exhumed, or that there really were children murdered and buried in some of these sites. I mean, shouldn't this be then a criminal investigation, a forensic one? I mean, if I'd reported, hey, there's a body buried in my backyard there behind my house, but no, I don't want you digging it up. I just wanted to tell you it's back there. Well, I'm not going to have a choice in the matter anymore. If there's any evidence of it, the police are going to come in and they're going to dig a hole and see just what the heck happened there. But that doesn't seem to be the case here.
No, it's the. I mean, it's a little different in different places, but in most cases, the RCMP aren't involved at all. In a couple of places, the RCMP said, "Well, we're aware of it, but we're letting the First Nation lead the investigation." Well, what does that mean? If, like you say, you find evidence of a murder in your yard, the police don't say, "Well, you lead the investigation. Call us if you find something."
Yeah.
I think the Mounties probably realize that really there's nothing in this, and that if a body was found, it probably won't be a child from the school, and in any case, it was probably way beyond the point where police could do anything with it. If it's 75 years old, what are the police supposed to do? So, yeah, the police are not involved in any credible way in this. And you're right, they should be. If we took these reports seriously, the police ought to be leading the investigation. There ought to be crime scene tape up and teams exhuming and so on. But none of that is happening. So that gives you an idea that people who are in a position to understand what's going on actually don't take it seriously. It's all a performance. It's a performance, really.
Yeah. So getting to the bottom of the whole thing, though, because this is really causing a lot of damage. I mean, there's a lot of sensitivity between the First Nations and non-First Nations and people who are concerned. And I mean, this is just increasing the division. It's increasing a lot of hurt, whether things really, how they happened or where they happened. We need resolution, though. So I want to get to the hardest part. How are we going to close this off? Because this trend just seems to be snowballing rather than reaching a closure anywhere.
Yeah, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. Unfortunate to have to say that, but I don't see any signs that anybody in authority is going to exert any control over it. So I think it will continue to grow. Eventually, everything comes to an end and it will burn itself out, like the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts in the 17th century. And then later on, there will be a period of reflection and people will say, how could we have been so stupid? But these things can go on for a very long time in the absence, maybe especially in the absence of evidence, because the absence of evidence allows people to keep speculating. So I wish I could tell your viewers that it's going to get better, but I fear it's going to get worse. Those are all the signs that we're getting more and more of these reports. They're repeating the same methodology of pushing the GPR around, collecting stories, claiming to have found graves, but not exhuming and not testing in any real way. And as long as they continue to get money from the government to do that, I think it will continue.
It's unfortunate. I know I didn't expect a quick, easy answer, but I was hoping maybe, you've spent a lot of time on the First Nations issue, that you'd had a revelation and realized how we can, fix this, but it was worth a shot.
It's always my weakness as a pundit. I could never foretell the future. I was only good at explaining the past. So,
well, and you've written. I mean, as we close off, you've done a lot of work on this. You wrote First Nations Second Thoughts. I remember rushing out to get that, and at least you're going into the subject of how we can work towards fixing. I mean, the whole system in general is failing. I think Canadians and First Nations people all together. Are you still working on some items now? And where can people find information?
Yeah, most of my research on this topic in recent years has been published by the Fraser Institute. And anybody who's interested, just Google my name in conjunction with Fraser Institute, and you'll find a whole series of studies, many of which have a fiscal focus of like how much is the government spending and how much is it accomplishing. I've written quite a bit about the compensation well, I'm going to call it a racket, which has evolved since the big apology in 2008, Prime Minister Harper's apology for the residential schools and the compensation that was paid to the so-called survivors then. Well, that in Harper's mind, that was supposed to be the end. This brings it to a close. It turned out to be just the beginning. It was touched off a whole series of further class actions for different categories of First Nations people with different alleged grievances. And then when the Liberals were elected in 2015, Prime Minister Trudeau decided not to contest any of these. So it's like Star Trek, resistance is futile. Ever since 2015, the government simply negotiates a settlement every time somebody comes in with one of these class actions. And so billions and billions of dollars are being shoveled out the back of the truck. The biggest one, I don't know how many of your viewers are aware of this, a $40 billion settlement for alleged harms to children through the child welfare system. But there are many other class actions as well. And the government, in my opinion, is derelict in its duty. It's not contesting these so that they get a true hearing in court. They're saying, well, come on, let's negotiate. We'll put up some money for a settlement. And so we're running into the many billions of dollars. And the emotionalism surrounding the missing children and unmarked graves myths is a big part of what drives these. It makes it hard for people to view these grievances in any rational context, because what's more emotional than a missing child, so all this kind of fits together, and sadly, it's maybe a new government will bring a change, but don't know how confident I am. Pierre Poliver's crowd, they voted 4 months ago for a parliamentary resolution that Indian residential schools were actual genocide. I mean, do they even believe what they're saying? If that's true, there should be an international investigation, and this is what happens when you have a real genocide. I mean, they're just saying, they're playing with words, but it builds the emotionalism.
Yeah, well, and it's funny because I was going to speak. I've got it queued up a little more on that. With I have the definition in front of me, at least one definition of what if you're going to declare something a genocide. And it says an assessment of both individual and state responsibility requires a considerable body of evidence and must be carried out by a competent tribunal charged with the task. Well, nothing like that has happened yet. So you're really making a big leap to a very loaded word without having followed the process to really claim if that happened or not.
Yeah, it's a vocabulary inflation. Of course, this happens all the time in politics. People are constantly reaching for more dramatic language. And so they reached for the word genocide and took it off the shelf. And first it was cultural genocide, which is, well, I think it's a bad phrase, but maybe you could justify it as a kind of a metaphor. But very quickly, cultural genocide turned into actual, literal, physical genocide, which is crazy, because if that was true, how can there be more Indigenous people in Canada now than there ever were before the Europeans came? I mean, if it was a genocide, it wasn't a very effective one. But of course, it wasn't a genocide. It was an attempt at acculturation to make it possible for Indigenous people to fit into the new society, which was being created by immigration. And you can argue about whether that was right or wrong, but it wasn't genocidal. So even the leading historians who opened up the whole residential school issue, for example, Jim Miller at the University of Saskatchewan, whose book Shingwalk's Vision was the first one that I read on the topic, and he's very critical of the schools. And he was a pioneering scholar, excellent scholar. But he's flatly stated there was no genocide, and there are no unmarked graves, and there are no missing children. So this thing has just spiraled out of control, and now it's being driven by people that are playing with words that ultimately for financial benefit, I think.
Well, and so if you got another moment, I didn't really want to dive into this, but since it kind of segued into it, I mean, we saw a House of Commons motion from the same one who declared that the residential schools were a genocide. The same member of Parliament now is proposing to make it a crime to deny or question the genocide. Like, this is very scary turf that they're starting to tread into on criminalizing this discussion you and I are having today, by definition, from what this member of parliament wants to enshrine into law, could land us in the legal soup. I mean, this is getting too far, but it doesn't seem to be stopping.
Yeah, well, maybe Professor Miller and I should be packing our toothbrushes. I don't know if they let you bring your own toothbrush into prison or not. There was an excellent column today by Chris Selly in the National Post, which went into some of the details. And after reading that, I think maybe people can relax a little bit. And even if the thing is passed, it's probably going to have qualifications in it which will make it unenforceable. So it will turn out to be probably another exercise in virtue signaling without real world consequences, except for the way in which it debases the climate of public opinion. So if legislation like that is passed, as soon as anybody says something which doesn't agree with current majority opinion, he can be attacked as, purveying hate speech and so on. So this should really be strangled before it gets any further. Again, what will the Conservatives do? What will the Liberals? It's an NDP proposal. The bigger parties are supposed to be, more responsible, but they voted en masse for the original residential schools equals genocide proposal. Will they now come back and vote for this resolution? I hope not, but I can't. Again, I'm not totally optimistic about it.
Yeah, well, we'll watch with interest. I guess the game just keeps rolling on and on. It's just it seems to be in such a bad direction right now. I appreciate you coming on to speak to us today, though, and kind of examine some of these issues a little further and explain a little bit of what's going on there and the work you've done and still are doing. For those guys that are just listening on the audio version, as the professor said, if you Google Tom Flanagan and Fraser Institute, you'll find those sorts of things, or you could find a copy of some of those books out there as well, and things such as that. So thank you for coming on the show again today. I really appreciate it, and maybe one of these days we'll see. Well, as you said, probably in the long run, we'll be using hindsight, or our kids will, and realizing this was a bad endeavor. But if we could speed the progress towards a conclusion, it would be nice.
Well, yeah, final word. What I feel I'm doing, and others, we're not really having much opinion on public opinion right now. I mean, we have people like you who are covering the issue, but we're not getting much traction in the mainstream media. But I hope that we're laying down a factual record that when the time comes for reevaluation, and something like this is happening at a much more accelerated pace with the COVID hysteria. 2 years ago, we were all running around about the sky is falling. Now there's a lot of good scientific studies coming out in referee journals like The Lancet, a lot of stuff coming out say, hey, wait a minute, we way overreacted. So I think there is some value in trying to establish a factual record, even if it doesn't have a big political impact at the moment, but it's there when the time comes.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and hope we can talk again soon.
Okay, Cory, thanks for what you're doing.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
So again, that was Professor Tom Flanagan. He's been on the show before, and he's done a great deal of work, really well worth looking up. Of course, after the show, you got to make it to the end here, guys. Then you can go look at all that body of work that's out there on this issue and many others that Professor Flanagan has worked on. Jimmy Parnell saying no toothbrush from home in jail. So there we go. I know, because you got to do all that work to file it into a shiv and stuff. I've watched all those shows. So whatever you pack up there on your way into jail, maybe a toothbrush isn't the thing for it. But I mean, as he did put it, I did read that Chris Selly piece on that with the motion to try and criminalize even, questioning whether or not it was a genocide at the residential schools. And it's true, like the chances of conviction are would probably be really slim in it. But we also know, I mean, that kind of ties into what I was talking about before with self-defense. The process can be the punishment. They can really beat the heck out of you while you defend yourself if that law is brought in. And it would bring a chilling effect. So a lot of publications or individuals just might think, you know what, I just don't even want to talk about it. So they won't. And that's a big, big danger. I think Selly's story also referenced like Ernst Zundel. And for those old enough to remember, I mean, he was a very odious, outright Holocaust denier, anti-Semite. There's no getting around that. But I mean, again, I don't even believe guys like him should be, charged. You just sideline him as the hateful kook that he is. But he went through a whole bunch of charges and everything else. And at the end of it, I guess retroactively, the charges were kind of lifted for his Holocaust denial in Canada, even though technically that's supposed to be illegal. So it is harder to criminalize that sort of discussion than an NDP member of parliament making that motion in the House might think it is. So we needn't sweat it too much, but we've got to have the discussions. I mean, when people want to criminalize speech, you always have to let get your alarm bells up. I mean, this is scary. This is problematic. I mean, hash it out, fight it out, sideline people, call people things, fine, but don't criminalize the speech. And that's what they want to do. And this ongoing thing, it just frustrates me to no end. I mean, we are working on a myth. Some of the stuff they've talked about, as I was talked about with Professor Flanagan to begin with, a lot of this has been tipped off by oral history in Kamloops. That's why I wanted to speak of it, because these were stories that came in. I believe that a lot of the people who testified saying these things believe these things really happened. These were members who were kids in the residential school there. And they said they'd heard about children being murdered down in the furnace room, babies hung from hooks. There were stories, outrageous stories, children being brought up in the night and taken out with shovels and forced to dig the holes to bury the murdered bodies of their compatriots. Now, that's horrific. And that is a murder allegation, a gross murder allegation of the worst sort. So why is there not a forensic investigation going on? Well, and the other thing is, you remember kids' stories, right? These are kids that told each other stories in the night when they were in a boarding school, basically. A lot of them are fairy tales. No, maybe not necessarily all. Maybe they'll dig a hole and find a body, but we've got to start digging some holes, you guys. And some people think that when we question these things that we're saying that the residential school system was a good idea. No, that school was, there was a lot of things wrong, that school system, and there was a lot of abuses. In the Port Alberni case, the one recently where they feel that they might have found, where they found more GPR anomalies, there was a school custodian who between the 40s and 60s, he got convicted for a whole pile of sexual assaults on the children there. Like, there's some children endured some horrific treatment in those schools. There's no getting around that. Unfortunately, sick pedophiles and predators are always drawn to circumstances where they can get access to children. I mean, they're monsters. They're predators. And those residential schools, I mean, they would have been a magnet for those kinds of pieces of human garbage. And they went to those schools, and they abused some kids. There was stuff that went on. I mean, there was stuff recently that still, again, the rights of First Nations people were definitely stepped on. There used to have to be an Indian agent on the reserve, and a First Nations person would actually have to register and get permission to leave the reserve. And I'm not talking about at 1890, I'm talking about 1950. So yeah, we've got things that happened that we want to clarify. There's only so much that, again, we've settled though. Now it's just, I mean, they talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Well, let's get to the truth. And yes, there were bad things, but we've got a lot of things that are exaggerated, a lot of things that are claimed that obviously didn't happen. We need to investigate further. We can't quell investigation on this. And it's being stifled. I mean, some of the stuff too is the expansion of the terms, and that's what Professor Flanagan spoke of as well. And we're talking about where you talk about genocide, and somebody else mentioned the term survivors. Everybody's a survivor. Now they're talking about kids who went to day schools as survivors. They reference them as survivors. They're kids who went to school. They're like anybody bloody else. Come on. How far does this go? What did you survive? You survived a strap? Hey, I went to an all-boys English-style school. I survived the cane. Unpleasant. And something that schools don't do anymore. I don't reference myself as a survivor. But it just keeps going on. And now we're compensating like third generation down from people who even attended these schools. We got to remember, only 150,000 children over the course of 100 years actually attended these schools. A tiny percentage of them. And that were residential. And most of those were voluntary, believe it or not. They weren't snatched out of households. Again, getting back to some of the mythology, though there were some that were forced. And some of the other stuff that's talked about, this 60s snatch, they talk about the amount of children taken in and put into foster care and social services. And unfortunately, some got abused once they got into foster care. But Nobody likes to talk about it. They were taken from households that were a mess. They were taken from households that were abusive. They were taken from households that were filthy. They were taken from households where these children were being abused or malnourished, or the parents were immersed in substance abuse and couldn't properly care for the children. That's why they were taken out. And the state would have been faulted if you leave children in those conditions. Then whose fault is that when that child gets beaten to death or molested or starved to death in those households? What we got to look at is the bigger picture. Why are so many households so dysfunctional on First Nation reserves? Now that gets into a much bigger discussion because, I mean, yes, and I've said it many a time, the entire First Nations reserve system is wrong. It's racial apartheid. It's separating a whole separate race from the rest of society. It's making them dependent on everybody else. There's not many opportunities for people to pay their own bills, find employment, things like that on the reserves. You've just got a recipe for a dysfunctional society for the people on there, plus constantly telling them of false stories of potential abuse. I mean, and there was real abuse too, but we're just increasing the division, the sense of victimhood, the hurt, and it leads to more substance abuse, and this cycle keeps going and going and going. If you really want to see an end, and I know I'm not going to see it in my lifetime, but this reserve system has got to end. It's not getting anywhere. I mean, who's winning? Who's winning? Who's doing well? I mean, I know people complain about the costs on reserves and things like that. Whatever. You know what? If they were all the people living on reserves were living comfortably and happy and doing well, I might be frustrated with the cost, but I'd be okay with that. But the cost is high and they're living in misery. Go check it out, guys. Go out, get onto a reserve. Most people haven't been on one. I worked in the oil field for decades. I worked on all sorts of isolated reserves. And I tell you what, they're bloody rough and people are living in nasty, nasty condition. But it's not going to change as long as they're stuck on those segregated areas. Pat Andrusiak saying in the Indian Act, and as well, yes, the Indian Act itself is a gross racist document. It's over 100 and some years old, and race-based policy. It's always wrong. Race-based policy was wrong in the past, absolutely, but we can't fix it by adding more race-based policy. I mean, I think the more race-based policy is making it worse. I don't think it, I know it. I mean, Canada has not had a pretty history. We turned back boatloads of Jews, refugees in World War II. We interred Japanese people in Canada and stole their property in World War II. This wasn't that long ago, relatively. The Chinese, they were put on boats and shipped back to China after they worked so hard to help build the railway that they say created this country. But of all of them, are the Jews an underclass that are having a hard time in Canada? The Japanese, the Chinese, actually no, Asians, I don't know, I haven't seen the numbers on Jews, but for the most part, they're usually doing pretty good. We didn't separate them into other areas and try to keep compensating and compensating and compensating. Instead, they moved forward and they're doing well as cultures and societies. They maintain their cultural roots and still stay functional. Holy cow, we're getting along. It's not assimilation. You still see plenty of observances for Seder and Hanukkah and maybe things with Jews. Chinatown, of course, is fantastic downtown in Japanese culture. So look at that. You could be within the society and not have to live on a separate reserve and still maintain the cultural practices of your roots. Why is that considered impossible with First Nations? Why is that considered racist to say that we could do that with First Nations? Why is it assimilation to ask of that? It isn't. And what's going on anyways, unfortunately, a lot of the confidence is being lost in the reserves. It's ruining some very good people. All right, I'm all ranted out. I had a whole bunch more stories I wanted to cover today, but of course, when I get on that First Nations one, because I got to see it a lot firsthand and how bad it is on the reserves and how dead end it is, it does get me upset. It really does, because it really is a waste of very good people, and we're going way down the wrong path of trying to resolve this and make for a better future for them and everybody else. Either way, I'm going to close up. Next week, I've got another professor coming in, and another one is considered controversial at times, Professor Frances Widdowson. She was turned away at the University of Lethbridge as a speaker by a bunch of screaming woke little babies. Yes, the students there, the snowflakes. But I want to talk not so much about what Professor Widdowson did to stir up the world, but the dangers, again, of having the woke shutting down discourse and how bad our post-secondary institutions have gotten. So, yes, it's going to be another interesting conversation next week. Dave will probably be back. We'll see. And, of course, there'll be lots of other news items, things going on. The pipeline will be on tonight at 7 o'clock. Tune in for that. We'll be covering a few more issues. I'll be on that as well. And aside from that, keep coming to the Western Standard, guys, and thanks for joining us today. I'll see you all again next week at this time.
Canadian Shooting Sports Association. Without the CSSA, our gun rights would have been taken long ago. These guys are on the front lines helping to draft smart and intelligent firearms regulations and legislation in Canada, and more importantly, educating the public about how we keep guns out of the hands of the wrong people. To become a member, it's absolutely worth every penny.
Here's an update on commodity prices from Lethbridge, where it's currently -23. Cash barley remains at $4.20, feed wheat is steady at $4.41, and corn is unchanged at $4.44 per metric ton. In the milling wheat markets, May Minneapolis futures are lower 8.5 cents at $9.10 per bushel, with local hard red spring bid for April movement at $11.55. Looking at canola, nearby canola futures are higher 60 cents at $8.3250 per ton, with delivered buys for March-April at $18.45 per bushel. In the pulse markets, nearby red lentil prices are lower 0.5 cent at 29 cents per pound, and yellow peas remain at $12.50 per bushel. In the cattle markets, April live cattle added 7.5 cents at $165.18 per hundredweight. For more information on pricing or picked up options, give me a call at 403-394-1711. I'm Matt Busicum at Marketplace Commodities. Accurate real-time marketing information and pricing options.